The DJI OSMO Pocket 4 is here, but does this camera bring massive upgrades or is it more iterative? I absolutely love my DJI OSMO Pocket 3. It kind of became a surprise hit for me. It became an everyday carry camera. It was small, it had decent image quality, all-day battery life, but most importantly, in a world full of good cameras where every camera kind of just does what you want, it was actually interesting and fun to use. It was a little bit different. So its successor, the DJI OSMO Pocket 4, does have some big boots to fill. And at first glance, it really doesn't look all that different apart from two new physical buttons on the front. You know, it's still got a single camera with a 20mm equivalent f2.0 lens built into a gimbal head with the wonderfully tactile flippy screen. Most of the upgrades in this little camera are buried deep inside. They're on the tech spec sheet. So some of these will definitely be enough to justify the upgrade for some people, but for others, maybe not. So will this be a camera for you? Stick around and let's find out. The only question that I'm really bothered in when it came to looking at this camera, the OSMO Pocket 4, is does it produce a better image than the OSMO Pocket 3? And the answer is yes, it does. In this little thing, we are finally getting a full-fat D-Log profile to record in 10 bits. And from my perspective, that's the thing that's got me most excited about this camera. But not only that, the OP4 has a new sensor, which DJI claims to have 14 stops of dynamic range. I believe the OP3 was rated to have around 12 or 13. But you know, generally we tend to take those dynamic range values with a pinch of salt. One thing I really need to point out straight away is just the color fidelity in this thing. It is leagues above the previous camera. There seems to be just like more tonality across colors. But I think the biggest difference I'm seeing when I'm working with footage from this camera is just in the skin tones. So I guess with that log profile, you're just getting a smoother gradient between colors, which just allows skin tones at different exposures to look better than on the previous camera. And so even when you are underexposing stuff and pushing this camera into more extremes, it tends to respond a lot better than the previous one. The OP3 had 10-bit recording, but it was in dlog-m. You know, that wasn't a proper log profile. It was basically a low contrast, desaturated Rec. 709 profile that was, you know, a little bit more friendly for color grading, but it still meant that you couldn't really push your image as far as a full fat log profile. So you could squeeze a nice image out of it, definitely, but you did have to be really careful with how you shot your footage. You sort of had to capture stuff in what I call that Goldilocks zone for exposure. The highlights clipped quite soon and quite harshly, which often meant that you had to drag exposure down using ND filters, which meant you were often capturing scenes darker than you actually wanted to keep those highlights in check. And that sometimes led to noisy shadows and sort of waxy looking skin tones. But on the OP4 now, with the new sensor and the bump in dynamic range and now a proper log profile, this essentially translates into a much better experience all round. So I just want to show you a side-by-side comparison between these two cameras. The exposures look very different, and it's not quite a fair test, right? Because one's a proper log profile that has much more dynamic range. It can compress much more dynamic range in the image, and the other's a Rec. 709 image. Same settings on both cameras, ISO 400. And as I move towards the window, you'll see the OP3 clips a lot sooner than the OP4. So you're getting more dynamic range in the log profile, and that's a huge benefit that you get with the new camera. So now we're just in the standard normal Rec. 709 internal profile on each camera. If I walk towards the window, you'll see that the OP3 will clip first. So you're still getting more dynamic range in the OP4, even in the standard Rec. 709 profiles, but you just won't get the same dynamic range than capturing in that log profile. The OP3 is a lot more neutral and cool, I would say, and at the same white balance 5600, the OP4 is a lot warmer. It's a bit more green, but this camera does now introduce a tint slider, so you can counteract some of that or dial it in how you want. I find it's better to run a little bit more magenta into the image because straight out of camera, The OP4 is a little bit more green. The Osmo Pocket 4 does have upgrades to the autofocus system, so it has upgrades to the active track system. That's basically the autofocus mode where it locks onto a subject and uses the gimbal head to track. And the types of subjects and the range of subjects on the OP4 has been vastly improved, so it now extends to stuff like vehicles, motorbikes, cars, and stuff like that. And generally across the board, the moving and tracking behavior does seem to be slightly improved over the previous camera, although I wouldn't say it's like a huge night and day difference. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that the OP4 has a tiny 1-inch sensor. There's no getting away from that. Unlike larger sensors, it is just going to suffer from noise in low light compared to a full frame or even Super 35 or even Micro Four Thirds sensor. Although DJI have now improved the low light performance on this camera, you know, it's still not going to compare to larger cameras, but that's okay. I'm never expecting it to. Well, you can still shoot with it at night. When I was in Turin in Italy with my partner Steph, we were shooting, I tested it out and shot some night shots at ISO 800, perfectly usable shots. And often in the day, I'm dragging down exposure on the camera with heavy ND filters. And again, the shots are looking really nice as well. It does have a dedicated night shooting thing, so if you are really interested in getting low light performance, that's the way to squeeze the most out of it, I assume, because you can't capture in D-Log and you can't change the sharpening and noise reduction settings, that it has a pre-dialed in noise reduction profile that's just going to give you the best balance between image quality and noise. Achieving stuff like shallow depth of field is always going to be tricky, and it just requires you to get a bit creative with the camera. So as long as you're up close with your subjects, you can get some of that background separation and it can look quite nice and, you know, cinematic, if you want to use that word. I generally turn off all noise reduction and sharpening as I prefer to control this in post. And I find that produces the nicest, least over-processed image. Generally in normal D-Log, I found noise creeping in between ISO 800 and ISO 1600 in underexposed and shadow areas, but if you have good exposure, you can get great results shooting between those two ISOs. Another thing I found was interesting is that the lowest ISO on this camera in D-Log is 400, whereas on the OP3, I think you could go down as low as 50. Generally, the new sensor in the log profile does give you a noticeable bump in dynamic range. Highlights clip less harshly and less soon. And that took a while to get used to and to feel a little bit safer shooting on this camera, because I just assumed everything was going to blow out, all the highlights. But after the first few days of filming, I realized it was a lot more forgiving. And overall, it just meant that I wasn't having to drag the exposure down as aggressively as I was on the previous camera. So for some people, I understand these differences will be subtle, they might not be things that they're particularly interested in, but I think there's definitely a subset of people who love using this camera, and me especially, I love using it for like street videography. It's so small to carry around and being able to boot it up in seconds and shoot stuff. So for people like me, these are generally big and much wanted upgrades. Another headline update is that the camera can now shoot up to 240 frames a second in 4K. That's bumped up from 120 frames a second on the OP3. However, there is one small caveat. On the previous camera, you could capture in high frame rates using the dlog-m profile, whereas here you can't capture high frame rates or any of the high frame rate range in D-Log. It's just in Rec 709 profile. So the Rec 709 stuff looks more processed, highlights clip sooner, it can be noisier. And that just means you can't get consistency of footage and shots between, you know, your beautifully graded D-Log footage and the Rec 709 stuff. I assume it's a hardware limitation associated with capturing in D-Log, but I think what would be really cool is if that is a limitation, then just give us dlog-m. If that's still a Rec 709 profile and it's capable with the existing hardware, that would be a nice way of bridging the divide between the Rec 709 footage and the other footage captured in D-Log. So what else is new in this camera? Well, another huge upgrade in the OP4 is it now comes with 107 gigabytes of internal storage. I think this is a pretty big upgrade. I hate micro SD cards and the fact that when you buy a new camera, you have to buy them, they're fiddly, they're small, they're really easy to lose. And in the end, like the micro SD card just basically lived in my Osmo Pocket 3. It never came out. You know, I took this on a free 4-day trip to Italy and I filmed across those 4 days and I never filled the internal storage up on this, and the footage is still on the camera, you know, and I've done several other days filming around London for capturing footage for this review. So it's more than enough for like a trip or even several trips, I reckon. Of course, you can add an additional micro SD card if you want to expand your storage. And I feel like the transfer speeds whilst offloading footage from this camera is also a little bit faster than the previous one as well. Even with my tiny, spidey, spindly fingers, trying to dial stuff in on this tiny screen is frustrating at the best of times. So you have two physical buttons here, they're completely customizable, and they can be context mapped as well. So you can have single press, double press, and triple press, and all of those different context mappings can be mapped to different functions, which is fantastic. They've also updated the joystick, so it has a slightly finer, more analog response, and in testing it does seem to respond a lot better. On the previous camera, movements with the joystick could be a little bit jerky and robotic, and they do seem a little bit more smoother and organic now, which is a nice thing to have. You can also now record up to 4 channels of audio on this thing, which is really cool. So you have the internal stereo mics as 2 channels, and then you can now connect, instead of just 1, up to 2 external mics, which is really cool. And again, just expands the use cases of this camera, because you can now record interviews with 2 people on screen at once. Carried over from the Osmo Pocket 3 is also the 2x lossless zoom, which is now mapped by default to the new left button. Unlike the Osmo Pocket 3, this now works when shooting in D-Log and when in active track. This isn't an optical zoom, it is a digital zoom or cropping. I don't know whether I would call it truly lossless. I do notice more noise when zooming, but I do have noise reduction turned off in camera, so I can just denoise it in post if I need to. And there is a further digital zoom or crop on the digital zoom setting. Again, noise will get worse when using this, but in well exposed shots, it works well enough. Lastly, the OP4 also comes with a new set of film tones. These are basically just creative filters or inbuilt LUTs that you can apply to the Rec. 709 image. There's about 5 of them, and the best bit is you can dial the intensity of these in. I think what would be amazing if DJI allowed users to add their own custom LUTs. But out of the 5 available, I think retro and movie are maybe my favorite, and I tend to dial them right back just to get a hint of them coming in. 2 years ago, I bought an iPhone 16. I already had the Osmo Pocket 3, and I had the full belief that I was going to become an iPhone videographer, cinematographer. I bought all of the extras, the cases, the clip-on filters, and I just didn't love filming on my phone. For me personally, I just realized I much prefer a dedicated camera, something that is tiny, it fits in your pocket alongside your phone, and you can just whip it out, power it on, capture some stuff, put it away, and get on with what you're doing. You're not also going to be fighting with the internal storage on your phone. You're not having to carry around loads of additional accessories. You know, everything that you need for this camera comes in a tiny pouch, and it slips into a pocket or a small bag, and you have everything you need. So I think having something that works with my creativity and inspires me, it's really important to me, and my phone just doesn't do that for me. Like, I'm just not out there capturing content when I travel on my phone. I'm not filming stuff when I'm on the streets. I am doing that on my Osmo Pocket. The other thing about this camera is that there is just this whole DJI ecosystem that pairs seamlessly with it. So you've got the DJI mics, you've got the smartphone app, you've now got new accessories that this bundles with as well. Stuff like fill lights if you need a light on the camera. This feels like a nice dedicated little production tool, especially if you're a content creator on the move. It's small scale, but very powerful if you know how to use it. So although it's definitely not reinventing the wheel or pushing the tech forward in massive ways or huge obvious ways, if you are a content creator or a casual user and you're already happy with the image quality from the OP3, then sure, maybe you won't notice the upgrades on this thing, and maybe they're a little bit more iterative. But for me, and I'm sure a lot of those cinephiles who notice the difference between grading a Rec. 709 profile and a log profile, that's a big difference. The quality on this thing is now definitely at a level where in a pinch, you could comfortably run outside on a larger scale project where you're shooting on cinema cameras and quickly capture some wide establishing shots or external shots or cityscapes on this little thing if you really need to. And I think they would mix and cut in well as long as you expose them and graded them properly. Recently, when I travel and I don't want to bring a professional camera, like I need a break from cameras sometimes, I opt to bring a little X100V Fujifilm for stills. And over the last 2 years, I've just been bringing my Osmo Pocket 3 with me, and they both fit into a tiny little bum bag, a little sling bag. And I actually love what that offers me. I've got my stills ticked off and I've got my videography ticked off. I can scratch those itches if I want to when I'm on holiday. I don't need to worry about batteries, SD cards, camera cases, interchangeable lenses, all of the faff that honestly, as someone who works with cameras all the time, I need a break from that stuff. So I'll hopefully put out some more content on this camera in the coming months. Thank you to everyone with the DJI Osmo Pocket 3 who bought my Palermo color grading LUTs and power grade. Everything you've seen in this video using D-Log has been graded with a new version of Palermo that I'm working on right now, and I intend to release that at some point in the coming months alongside this camera. So depending on when you watch this video, maybe it's already out and there'll be a link to buy it in a description down below. But if you want some LUTs or a power grade that will help you squeeze the most out of this and get interesting looking image, then definitely please consider checking that out. And again, depending on when you watch this video, when I launch it, I'll be launching that at a discount, so there'll be a chance to pick it up cheap. That's been my first look at the new DJI Osmo Pocket 4. If you have any questions, please just drop them down in the comments down below. I just love these cameras. Maybe you don't, that's fine. Let me know, let's have a chat about it in the comments. But thanks for watching. I'm Ed, and until next time, I'll catch you later. See ya.